Zelzer from PCDN. We're here for another episode of the Social Change Career Podcast live stream. Delighted to be here today with Dr. Katherine Collin, or Katie Collin, who is the director of the Conflict Resolution Graduate Program, Master's Program at Georgetown University. We're going to be talking about casting votes, shaping futures, careers at the intersection of peace, conflict, and governance. That's a mouthful. For people who have not joined one of our podcast live streams before, this generally goes about an hour, and we like to make it as interactive as possible. I'm Craig Zelzer from PCN, based in Medellin, Colombia. Catherine's in the DC area. So we like to make this as interactive as possible. So while we're streaming, in particular on LinkedIn, please in the comment section, feel free to write a sentence or two about your background, let us know where you're watching from, and your comments and questions, and we'll bring them in as much as possible. And I'll remind you a few times about that. This podcast will then be converted to an actual audio podcast, one of about 120 others on the Social Change Career Podcast, which you can find on PCN Global or any major podcasting platform. 3 requests: if you like the podcast, or if you don't, please consider rating and sharing it. Please follow the Georgetown Conflict Resolution Program. Please follow PCN. We're in the middle of season 11, lots of other good episodes coming up. And in transparency, I worked in the program for 10 years full time. I still teach there, and Georgetown does sometimes advertise on PCN, but I would have done this anyway, but that's in full transparency. And so, Katherine, thank you so much for joining us. And can you share a little bit about actually, let me do your bio. I just missed that. Sorry. At Georgetown University, Katherine steers the MA in Conflict Resolution program with an informed perspective forged through extensive academic and field experience. I would call her a pracademic or a scholar practitioner. Her academic credentials include a PhD from American University School of International Service, an MA in International Policy from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and a BA in History and Peace and Conflict Studies from UC Berkeley. Her work has taken her from a postdoctoral fellowship at the Brookings Institution. So for people from outside the US, Brookings is one of the leading think tanks. I think they celebrated 100 years anniversary centenary not that long ago, to collaborating with major international organizations such as the United Nations and IFES, which works on elections. She's worked on election projects with refugee and expat communities in various regions, including the US, Europe, Asia, MENA region, and sub-Saharan Africa. Her research and teaching are deeply informed by her commitment to understanding how democratic decision-making processes can contribute to or complicate the quest for peace. So thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule, especially when it's getting close to the end of the semester. And let me just welcome a few people. Welcome Hanan from Egypt. Welcome Jazarad from Spain. Please let us know. Also, feel free to share a sentence or two about your backgrounds. And so, Katherine, to get started, can you talk about, actually, let's start with a different question. When you think back to your younger age, let's say teenage years, did you envision yourself doing what you're doing now, or did you envision yourself in a completely different career? And how did you wind up working at this intersection of peace, governance, and elections?
I would say that when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a, citizen of the world. So in that way, I think that's when I look back on what I've done so far, I think that fits that category. I would say that I honed my career goals more as an undergraduate and then a graduate student. I was really interested in looking at peace processes, and that's one of the reasons why I studied peace and conflict studies in my undergraduate program. I spent a couple of years in Dublin at the University College Dublin before I went back to Cal. And the peace process in Ireland was getting started at the time. So that was something that was really focused my attention on this intersection that you're talking about, right? The governance, peace, and how to approach those as a unified field.
Just was on mute. So lots of people are joining from all over the world. Welcome from Nigeria, Mavis for some reason, some other comments aren't showing up here, but we got people from, I think, about 10 different countries. So please keep letting us know where you're watching from. And so I spent some time in Northern Ireland as well. Not a lot, just more short visits, and did some work in Northern Ireland, particularly with something called the Walsh Visa Program, which was so the question is, can you talk about, were you there, like what years did you start going to Northern Ireland, and then, or at least living in Ireland, and then were you there pre-Good Friday Agreement, post-Good Friday, and then from perspective, like when you were there, what did you see as the biggest opportunities in terms of, building a more sustainable governance and peace? And what were some of the challenges that you saw then that you think they might still be facing today?
Yeah, I want to reframe it just a little bit, just from thinking about my younger self and the impact of that. So I was in Dublin from 93 to 95. And so that was pre Good Friday, but it was also in the Republic. So it's the part of Ireland that's been in under peaceful governance, peaceful conditions for generations, but is still very much invested and impacted by what's happening in the north, and implicated in the conflict there. And so, so I got to see the north prior to the peace agreement, and really just as the peace process was seeming like it might be a real thing. And one of the things that I thought was really impactful, and I think shapes the way that I want to think about working in conflict spaces, is the way the conflict impacts people's day-to-day lives. And again, that means like from the really interpersonal, on up to the global, right? All of those levels are implicated in the way that I think about that, right? Like the way that people are circumscribed by conflict and given opportunities in the processes of making and building peace. That's, I think, what really interests me. And you could see that really clearly on both sides of that border. That just seems very, very arbitrary. And in many ways, it is an arbitrary border, um, although it's a long-standing one. You could really see the similarities in their lives between, over that border. And then really it helped put into relief the impact of conflict on people's lived experiences in the North. And I feel like I've seen that over and over again. One of the first places I worked in post-conflict settings and as a professional was in Kosovo. Just after that war, we were early in rebuilding or building government there. And that was another place where you could really see the impact of arbitrary borders on really otherwise similar lives. Yeah, and the opportunities that a peace process represented in a number of ways in people's lived experiences.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Juliet from Ireland, Mavis from Botswana. And again, for some reason, not all comments are showing up here. So going back, for people who don't know, I went to UMass Amherst, which we used to call the Berkeley of the East Coast. So we spent a lot of time protesting. I won't talk about which issues, but UC Berkeley has historically been a campus filled with lots of activism and engagement and has a great peace and conflict studies program for undergrads.
Yes.
So thinking about your undergrad and your master's, we'll talk about PhD later. What skills do you think you developed within those programs that have helped you in your career to date? And what things have you developed outside of formal education?
I think analytically, there were two lenses that were really important from undergrad and my MA program. And one is that peace and conflict studies lens, right? So rather than looking at international relations approaches or other kinds of political approaches, thinking about conflict and peace processes, I really appreciated a peace and conflict studies lens, right? So why is the conflict happening? What are the causes that are rooted in history? What are the escalatory forces? How might we de-escalate? What are the conflict processes that are driving the conflict in and of itself? Yeah, and then what's our toolbox, right, for working on a conflict? And that's really where the democracy comes in, and which is what I did in my professional life beyond peace studies. My MA is in international policy studies, and so looking at policy was also, is another important layer there, thinking about how you identify what can work, who's doing, who has lessons learned out there that you can draw from, how to collaborate with people that are, doing a policy that you might be able to draw from, how to collaborate with grassroots if you're working in a place that's not your own. Yeah, so policy processes on top of those peace and conflict studies, analytical tools, I think were what I use most as a practitioner.
Mhm. And thinking about analytical tools, or is it, assessment frameworks, different, sorry, different theories, models? Is there a particular practitioner, scholar that has most influenced your work, or at least, when you're working in the field?
So I think we probably all read Johann Galtung, right, in our first week in peace and conflict studies, and I certainly teach Johann Galtung and have my students read his work. But these basic concepts of how do we think about conflict, how do we think about peace, what violence is, right? And that violence resides in this interaction between your behaviors, your attitudes, and the structures in society, right? And that we really can't get at the manifest levels of violence unless we also are addressing the latent levels of violence. That is a framework that I see as relevant over and over, and not just in my field. I also really love, just to go back to my first week with peace and conflict studies, Elise Boulding has this quote about peace being the project of 200 years. And every place and space I've ever worked in, I try to remember that the long term is how we have to think about it. And it helps me to remember that the United States, we can also think about what we do here as a political project, as a post-conflict peace building project. We are a post-Civil War society, and we are still working on our imperatives for peace building in the United States. So, I really hope that we can pierce this artificial barrier between the way we think about how we do conflict resolution and peacemaking, peace building out there with how we apply it here. In the United States context, we use really different vocabulary. We forget to build those bridges within and without. And I hope to, contribute to reducing that.
Wonderful. Welcome, Ibrahim from Yemen, working with UNICEF, Chagungwa from Zambia. We have a bunch of people from Nigeria, from Kingston, Jamaica. So again, please bring your questions and comments in. So can you talk a little bit about, so just in terms of timing, so you did your MA and did you start working with the UN or IFIS, or just kind of some of the organizations or issues or locations you worked on? And
Yeah.
was it more research? Was it advocacy? Was it policy? In terms of, and who was funding the work? Was it USAID funded or?
Sure, great. I graduated from undergrad and I did a year of AmeriCorps in San Francisco. That's my hometown, and I felt that it was important to, be placed in my place to do social justice work, to do social impact work. So I was really happy to have that opportunity. The next year, I went and I was a UN volunteer in Kosovo. So that UN Volunteers is a program. It's administered by UNDP. It's a fantastic way to do field work with the UN. I highly, highly recommend it. It's one of my best professional experiences, and I feel really privileged and lucky to have worked with them. So I did those 2 years. One of the things that I took away from my time in Kosovo was, number one, this is what I wanted to do. In Kosovo, I worked with the UN on their first round of elections. It was a joint operation between the United Nations mission in Kosovo and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. They were jointly seeking to build up an administration in Kosovo, which was formerly, right, sub territory of Serbia, which is the former Yugoslavia. That year, I really realized that if I wanted to pursue field work with the UN in post-conflict spaces, I needed to have a master's. And so I went and got my master's at Monterey. Following up on my master's, I worked for Senator Paul Sarbanes, who's a Maryland senator, former Maryland senator, for about a year on foreign policy. He was on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. And I got an offer about a year in to go with the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, to work in Pakistan with Afghan refugees on their out-of-country election project. So based on networking that I had done in Kosovo, they called me to do the Pakistan job. Yeah, so that was the timeline, and from there, I worked for a while, contract to contract, mostly with the UN, and the agencies varied with the UN because who's responsible for which portion in a multidimensional peace operation has variation. So, yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Welcome, Pierre from South Sudan. Feel free to let us know what you're working on. So two questions here. So, generally our audience tends to be 25 to 40, but we have people who are younger and older.
Mhm.
And for people, whether from the rest of the world or the US or Europe, um, any advice, because UNV is a great opportunity. Generally, you have to be over 25, 3 to 5 years professional experience. About 90% of all their placements are national volunteers, about 10% are international. But Changugwa's commenting that he's applied for UNV and not been successful for. So just thinking like early stage, whether it's AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, volunteer service overseas, UNV, any
Yeah.
advice for how do people find the programs? Because there are lots of programs like that. What are the pros and cons? And from your experience, any thoughts on what makes someone more competitive, or is it really based on their skill set?
So finding programs like that, I relied on word of mouth. And that is, tried and true. So please, everybody should continue to, talk to their friends, talk to other people who are doing what you are interested in doing. That is like the first step. But there are also institutional sources of information there. So if you're in a university or you're an alumnus of a university, go and, talk to people at the Career Center who might be able to help you. I would say that's like the second rung. And then the third rung might be talking again to other folks that have followed career paths who might be, a few years older than you and asking them. I That's how I think about casting that net. Just figuring out what the programs are. For big programs like UNV, my advice would be, and like AmeriCorps, my advice is that you select more than just one. Like, don't pin your hopes on one because job hunts, some people get lucky and get that job that they wanted, like right out of the gate, right on time, and one is enough. And in the end, one is enough, right? But I would diversify that as much as possible. Um, Find as many things that you're interested in working on, and if they're a big program, send in your application and then like try to forget about it. So for me with UNV, I sent in my application a year before they called me back. And it's certainly, that's not abnormal. You have to just kind of let it sit there. It's good to be young and not have a lot of home and family responsibilities yet, because then when they call, you can respond in a way that where you can take jobs. And those two jobs that I mentioned, my first two, were very low paying. So one of the, I went to a state school. I worked. I graduated without debt. That is a really privileged thing to do, and I was able to take jobs that I was interested in for the experience of them rather than the pay. My positionality in life doesn't afford me that anymore. So I'm really grateful to have done that when I was much younger. The other thing I think that helps, right, is language skills, which I'm sure everybody, many people are already working on. Project management skills, whether that's in a job or in, volunteer world, anything that you can do where you can show that, they can give you something and trust you to manage it. That's those are important skills. Yeah, and with the language skills, I think is also being able to work with teams that are composed of people from a diverse array of backgrounds. That means different things in different places, but it's almost always true.
Wonderful advice. And Changungwa, a couple of other thoughts. So one is, as Catherine or Katie said, I always encourage people, don't just pin your hopes on one thing. Look at everything, or at least 5 to 10 different things, and try to do strong applications. The first thing is look at your application, because a lot of times I do a lot of fellowship reviews for all sorts of places, Rotary, Fulbright, Rise Fellowship, many, and funding ones. And a lot of times the person's skills might be amazing, but their application's not. So if your application, I mean, one, sometimes your skills don't match what the funder or the donor or the fellowship program is offering, and that's just not going to work. But a lot of times the skills are great, but maybe because of language differences or regional differences, people don't do compelling applications. So you really need Pro Fellow is a great resource. PCN is a great resource. And look at the major fellowship places like International Institute for Education, the Germans, the DADS, the Chevening. A lot of those places now give you some good guidance. And then there's AfriCorps. There's lots of other places, so don't just put it all. I don't know if it's called AfriCorps, but like African Union has something similar. UNDP has a fellowship for young African women. But it is not easy, and that is great advice. So I'm going to bring in a question from Dr. Pieras. Do you have any tips for mid-career former academic professors transitioning to these jobs? I guess someone going more from academia to more policy or practice. So you
Um,
kind of went the other way. So you might
I
have advice.
did.
Maybe you could offer both sets of advice if you want to go more from policy practice to academia and vice versa.
Yeah. I loved my transition. I really ended up with a set of questions from working in the field that I was happy to be able to pursue. Again, very privileged position. I was really happy to walk into a PhD program and be able to do research on what I had been doing. I think that that gives me a credibility as a researcher. Certainly gave me access as a researcher to people on the ground. It really informed and improved what I was able to do when I'm doing academic research. So I really appreciated that directionality. I also think that people with academic training do really, really well beyond academia. And I think that we should see more and more of that. And I hope that in addition to people with PhDs getting out and doing more than academia, that the wider world finds more use and appreciation of the skills that PhDs bring to jobs. Um, so specifically coming out of an academic job and going into policy and practice, I think maybe there's two routes, and it kind of depends on how you're set up and what your goals are. I think you can transition horizontally, right? Which might mean starting in a position where you feel like you're more senior than you ought to be and hoping to like move up the ladder quickly. And there, I would say, I hope that you leverage all of the research and organizational and management skills that PhDs bring you. Um, I also see people that kind of do that parachuting in, right? So they get policy appointments out of academia and to work on the areas where they're expert, and that's usually like at a not so much at a mid career, but more at a senior level. And I think that's a really useful career trajectory for both sides, right? That helps inform research, and it definitely uses research to inform policymaking at a high level. And there, I think it's about um, using your academic research to write toward a policy audience. If you haven't made the leap yet, right? Like think about the ways that your research is policy relevant and reach out to people that are doing policy and think tank work in your area and building those networks so that you can show the way that your research can apply in the policy space, if that is helpful.
So just to make a comment, then I'll bring in the next question from Stephanie. So I think when I was doing my PhD, I really wanted to do applied practice.
Yeah.
I mean, I finished in 2004. My wife Kathleen finished 2006. I think back then there was more of this like, oh, if you're going to do a PhD, you should go into academia. Like there was some pressure, and I think some programs still have that bias. But I really think one, because there's not that many full-time academic jobs, but two, it's become more common for people to float and not go between policy and practice. So I wound up I was in practice for many years. I wound up in academia for 10 years. Now I'm in social entrepreneurship. Katha went to policy. So just saying, it's also as you're doing the PhD, this is for people earlier stages. Really if your dream is to be an academic, like obviously you have to focus on research and publications and some other things. But even at that time, still, as you said, try to make sure your research that it used to be, they would look down like if an academic blogged or just did things like that. Now it's like becoming the academics, particularly once they get tenure, it's harder. But like creating a, let's say, a trail of breadcrumbs about your research that's more accessible, and thinking about if you want to go into industry or practice or INGOs, like having some skills that you can go different ways, because the people who do 100% academia and then later want to move can find it challenging, and vice versa. So thanks. So Stephanie, thanks for your question. So her name's not showing up here, but Stephanie, what about pivoting into this career field from the military? Are there barriers if military experience is the bulk of your career? Many of the critical competencies, program management, diverse teams, language, etc., can be acquired in the military while being paid reasonably well to build these capabilities, and also they'll often pay for school, at least in the US. So she's concerned her resume might be too security or military heavy. So do you have any advice for people who, whether they did 4 years or 20 years in the military, who want to move more towards governance or peace or research?
Yeah, so I would say that in the field, I worked with people with military backgrounds all the time, and that those skills sets, and there's more than one, are really valuable and important if you're doing work in the field in any kind of conflict space or post-conflict space. And those two things are not really distinct in many, many places. I worked on more than one mission that was, had a heavy NATO presence, and so we liaised almost constantly with the military, and so being on the other side and being a good military liaison is a role. We had logisticians that were almost entirely drawn from military backgrounds. That was they were the best at that, and elections is we always used to say that running an election is the biggest operation that you can do, other than a military operation. It's the biggest civilian logistical operation that you can run. I'm sure the census people say the same thing, but being able to put those missions together has there's really important uses for those skill sets. Moreover, I would say, and I often say this to my students, that the most important skills are soft skills. And in the field, you want to have this base of soft skills that relate to just being secure and operating well in insecure environments. And not everybody in the military is great at that, because not every military experience is the same. But it's likely that you're probably pretty good at it, and you're coming to the work with at least formal training in security in a way that other folks don't have, and that is really a value. So I think that baseline, your soft skills are probably really, really valuable. And I tell my students all the time, like, lead with soft skills and think about your soft skills. So I think that is a really fruitful path, and it's one that I see constantly when I was in practice.
And I'll just say, when I was at Georgetown full time, we would often have, I think we had one or two current military, then often we'd have, former military, whether they were paid on the GI Bill or other places. So a lot of people in the military, there's been increasing interest because obviously military has a role to play, but it doesn't have all the solutions. And peace, so some people go from military and want to build their peace building skills, and some people from peace building go more into security sector reform. But also there's some really good opportunities if you have both those skill sets combined with languages. That can be a really good thing. So just Ibrahim just asked quickly, is there any fellowships for people from Yemen? So again, Pro Fellow, PCN Global, you can find tons of fellowships, IIE, Rotary. I mean, there are a lot of fellowships, Schwartzman, but Catherine, I guess this is a question specific to Georgetown or just in general. When you're getting applications from students who are supremely well qualified, but come from countries where the cost is prohibitive, any fellowships, because we had students at Georgetown get Fulbrights or Rotary fellowships, but and there's a Rupe scholarship. Any when people come to you and they're an amazing candidate, and funding is a huge challenge. Like, does the program offer funding, or where else do you recommend people go, whether it's at Georgetown or elsewhere, to try to secure the resources?
Yeah. So I would say that there's a lot of variation between the levels. So undergraduate applicants versus graduate applicants at the MA level versus PhDs, each of those is a really different environment. So the answer for my program is really different from the answer inside my department at other levels. So please, big grain of salt. If you're not looking for an MA, then um, your opportunities are going to vary dramatically. And Craig, you just listed all of the places that I would send people for fellowships, right? Rotary in particular has more than one fellowship and scholarship program that is targeted just at Peace Scholars and at the MA level. I think it's really wonderful. They have that as a global program, so you can apply as a Peace Scholar. You can also apply to your local Rotary Club. There's a global pool that goes through the local clubs and funds a variety of kinds of MA education, including peace studies. Our program at Georgetown is expensive. Georgetown is expensive. And I always want to be able to bring people in who know what the balance of of what they're getting versus what they need to pay for is really crystal clear when they begin the program. That's part of the ethics of higher education, right? Like students should be well informed and they should understand that how the expense of their program versus what a typical income is when you get out of a program like ours. And so that's an important thing to think about. Of course, United States-based students in United States programs, they have access to federally subsidized funding or grants, or sorry, not grants, federally subsidized loans. Important distinction. Georgetown meets need-based requirements for undergraduate students, but not for graduate students. So our students are funded entirely out of a scholarship program that the program provides. And we know how much money we need to give like per cohort and per student so that we don't take away from our own bottom line, so that we can try to keep operating in the black. And it's relatively modest. We wish that it were bigger. And one of the things that we're currently trying to do is to try to find a way to endow the program so that we can grow that element of what we do, because we get applicants from places where we really want to send people with our training back to work on their, back to Yemen, back to Ukraine. So it's especially difficult for international students. You can apply anyway, and we can write you an Arupe application and try to work with you as best we can and just talk you through what the expenses are going to be. But yeah, please expect to have this be, it's a major, you spend 2 years, right? Or 18 months, right? So that's a major cost regardless of how much you're paying in money. That's opportunity cost. That is time from your life. That's the most precious thing. So if you can't spend that most precious resource, like think critically about that, and then think about the money too. And we can talk you through it. We're really happy to do that and go into every program with your eyes open.
Yes, great insights and comments. And a bunch of people are asking, are there full fellowships at Georgetown for this particular program? And just to be clear, there's a lot of partial fellowships. And there is the Arupi Fellowship, which there's only a couple awarded across the whole university, and we've had some get them. But Katherine said, Rotary, there's a Rotary Global Fellowship and Fulbright. A lot of Fulbright students do come.
Yeah.
The one thing we can talk about, a lot more fellowships we do in the Career Campus and Pro Fellow as well, but you generally need to apply for fellowships almost a year, like 9 to 14 months in advance. So a lot of people wait and like, oh my gosh, this is expensive. And then it's too late for most fellowships. So just to make that clear. And then the Rotary Peace Fellowship, they also advertise on PCN. That's separate, but it's one of the world's best for master's and professional training. So the applications, I think, open February 1st or February 15th. And It's to go to one of 6 or 7 university centers. There's 2 certificate programs, and then the rest are specific master's degrees. So again, like if you want to apply to Georgetown, great, but always, or you want to apply to Rotary, like always look at these 3 to 5 programs because that's just the general advice. So William is just commenting about the Rotary Peace Fellowship. So yes, it's wonderful. So I'm going to jump in with a question, then another question has come in. So first of all, so you decided to do a PhD, and probably let's say 10 to 15% of the people listening now or in the future might think about a PhD. So whether it was your own decision-making process or for your students and alum, when they start expressing interest in a PhD, what is your general advice, like how to decide if it's the right choice? And then if it's the right choice, how to select the right program field, it's like your general PhD wisdom.
So I want to start by just co-signing on something that you already said, right? Which is that there are fewer and fewer jobs inside higher education as a professor, right? Tenure track professors, those jobs are fewer and fewer. Higher education as an industry has really transformed over in our generation, right? So going back to the 80s, but really accelerating in the last 20 years. So if you want to be an academic, if you want to be a professor, a PhD is necessary training. And you need to get a certain kind of PhD from a certain kind of institution to, make that the best value proposition that it can be if you want to be a professor. If you want to be a professor, you should know that there are more PhDs produced every year by far than there are jobs entering into being a tenure track professor. So even people who do everything right, as we've been saying about all these other career tracks, it's not having a PhD doesn't get you a ticket to being an academic. And many, many people, therefore, are using their PhDs in other ways, which I think is a really valuable development. I think it's lamentable, in some ways that higher education has transformed in the way that it has, and it's made being an academic more precarious than it used to be. But I think it's wonderful that we can bring the training and skills of rigorous and really detail-oriented and, middle range theory building research beyond academia in ways that I think are going to be more and more common. I wanted to do fieldwork better and at a higher level, and that's why I went back for my PhD. And so I went to a place that was interdisciplinary, that was international, and that where I could focus on peace and conflict studies, that had a concentration in international peace and conflict resolution. So my PhD training is in this field, and I feel really lucky to do that. And they trained people that would write policy relevant dissertations. And so not every academic department trains you in that way. So for instance, Georgetown's department in its PhD is far more traditional. And it wouldn't have been the right place for me, even though it is the right place for me now, as a professional. So yeah, I want people to look at their goals. Again, it's a big opportunity cost, so make sure you can pay that opportunity cost in years, and then be as tailored as possible. And PhDs are funded, so don't pay for a PhD. A PhD, you should pay no tuition, and you should get on-campus work, and you should have an annual stipend.
Stipend.
Yeah, that covers you. Again, it's going to be like AmeriCorps, like really low level, but nevertheless, it allows you to live while you are studying to be a PhD student. I worked my way through my PhD program in addition to the stipend, and yeah, that was fruitful. I enjoyed that.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to bring in the next question, and I wrote a post a few years ago called "The PhD or Not the PhD." It's not professional, but I'll share it because it gets into both selecting, but the cost benefit opportunity. Because I'll just say one story. When I was an undergrad, I remember there was a doctoral student who was teaching in our program, and she's like, "The PhD is the hardest thing I've ever done," and I'm like, "No." And then once I started doing a PhD, oh my gosh, I almost quit so many times. So it's some people can do it in 3 years, but it's a hard process for a lot of people. So I think just understanding the opportunities and the cost. But the next question, I'm sorry, I couldn't get your name, but I did look. Could you touch on some of the most common misconceptions about peace studies that you see from students and others in the field?
Okay, and Craig, I'm sure you have thoughts about this as well. One of the biggest things is thinking about peace studies as something that's fluffy and light and not serious. Right. I think a lot of people, like from the security studies portion of our field, regard peace studies in that way. Peace studies can also be really gendered uncomfortably. I wouldn't disconnect the gendering of peace studies from that way of thinking about it. Um, I I also want to say that for my students, there's confusion about what peace studies is, what conflict resolution is. People come in with either really expansive and undefined concepts of what these things are, or extremely narrow concepts of what they are. And the way that I like to think about conflict resolution as a field is that it's something that encompasses a lot of practice areas, right? So that includes things like community-based dialogue. It includes things like inside human resources and inside government and labor negotiations. There's a whole slate of niche areas where you do conflict resolution. I think the skill sets are translatable from one to the other, but sometimes you really need specific skills in those niches. Um, and then writ large, I see conflict resolution writ large, like on this international stage, um, as where peace and conflict studies, peace and conflict resolution really come in, right? So being able to understand, do the conflict analysis, and being able to transition, right? So the peace operation that moves from peacekeeping to peace building and transitions off into something that's stable and durable. Um, that I think is that international, global, multilateral approach to the conflict resolution field. I'm not sure that I answered that question directly.
I think you did. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get the person's name. I asked the question. Feel free to ask more specifics. I think the two things I would add to that is one, it's a diverse field
Yeah.
that some people, it's a field in both a set of skills and a lens. So it's all three of those things. And that framework comes from the Alliance for Peace Building 2.0 report, which was funded by U Institute of Peace. You can look at that. It's probably about 6 years old now, but it's got a good summary. And the second thing is that it is not fluffy and it is not weak. So like a lot of people think peace builders are going out and hugging trees, and there's nothing wrong with tree hugging, but like it's some of the hardest work in the universe. Particularly if you're doing it in a conflict affected setting, but also whether you're a union organizer or labor, like it's not easy. And if it's interesting because Carrie Menkel Meadow, who used to teach at Georgetown, I think she's at UC Berkeley Irvine now, she's one of the world's leading ADR, alternative dispute resolution specialists, and she did an article, I think how mediation is portrayed in film and also in TV. And it's very funny because most of the times they portray a mediator in TV as like this comical, inept person, but it is not. So a question here is, can you talk a little bit about your current research and also your rich experience in the field? What whoever we is, or like what do you think, or what does the field know that actually could work under certain conditions? Like, are we making progress, whatever that means, in whether it's at the city level or global level? And like, what do we have some inkling that based on these conditions there could potentially be success? And what are some of those big questions that we don't know? And what are some of the things we don't even know we should be thinking about?
Um, I have two areas of research that I would like to think of as active. One is my building out from my dissertation research. And so that is the way that we use referendums in peacemaking processes. Um, so referendums can be really useful. Democratic processes in general, right? Governance is a way of channeling conflict into institutionalized forms, and democracy is hopefully the best way for us to do that. But there are really interesting innovations, I think, in the way that we think about what democracy is and how it could contribute. So going back to the Ireland example, Ireland's been doing really interesting work in thinking about democracy as a deliberative process. And I think that could have a lot of carryover into peacemaking, peace building. And you see peace agreements that build in community-based dialogue or, other processes for engaging with deliberative ways to get people's input into a peace agreement, a peace process, a peace building process. So that is one area of research for me, just looking at the different referendums, how they've been used, what the risks are, what the benefits are. You usually are going to see that in really robust processes where you've got scope for peacemaking that is beyond just a ceasefire, just getting to negative peace, just a diminution of violence. In other words, we can do some of the work of conflict transformation. We can address some of the societal issues that might be driving conflict in that peace agreement. I think you see less and less space for that. I think over the past 10 years, at least since 2015, we've been seeing more and more conflicts that emerge, and we've been seeing fewer and fewer that are being resolved. The conflicts that are out there, in other words, are more intractable, and they are more diverse. So the scope of what we can do with peacemaking has narrowed significantly, in my opinion. That's what I see looking out there. I think that we had this toolkit that was, an agenda for peace. And it worked from 92 imperfectly, up to 2005, 2010. We really it started to break down in a post 9/11 world, right? The global conditions really changed. That toolkit doesn't work so well anymore. That's, conflict prevention, international mediation, peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. It hasn't been working. And we need a new toolkit. We need to wedge open space for doing more ambitious peacemaking and not just getting warriors to stop using violence as a policy tool. So we don't really understand war very well, and we're not well calibrated in our peace toolkit to the kinds of war that's happening right now. But more than that, most violence out there in the world, most organized violence, and most political violence is not associated necessarily with war. We have a lot of organized violence that is criminal in nature, but scoped out and impactful like a war. And we don't have really good tools for dealing with that, certainly at a multilateral level. We don't have good tools for dealing with the economic pushes and pulls that intersect with that kind of violence. So I think we've got multiple problems. We've got this grassroots problem where we see organized violence kind of ballooning out. We've got this higher level diplomatic problem where for multiple generations, it had been disallowed to use the onset of a war as a tool for policymaking, for pursuing national interests. And that norm, at least a little bit, has broken down, and it's led to some catastrophic wars. So not to be negative, but I hope that my students can contribute to that, like understanding war and organized violence better and building out our toolkit to match what we're seeing in the world right now. That's where I want my contribution to be.
Wonderful. I mean, not wonderful. It's very hard, but so two questions. Again, we have a few more minutes if anybody else wants to ask questions or make comments. So let's say you're at a dinner or a party where someone hears that you engage in conflict resolution and governance work, and they have this skepticism. And we used to kind of ask this in some of the comp questions when there was comps in it. So someone just says, this is all a bunch of malarkey, and we need hard security at all costs. And do you have any evidence you like to cite, whatever sector of peace building, that shows it? Because there is a huge imbalance. We spend almost $2 trillion a year on war or defense, and the number on peace building, I mean, development's 140 billion, but peace building is tiny. So
Yeah.
I mean, any evidence you cite to say this is not just people trying to make you feel good. There is real evidence we should invest more in this, whatever this means.
Well, first of all, I think I would say that I don't disagree that we need hard security. I think that is a basis for peace, right? We have to have negative peace before we can build out toward positive peace, or at least that's sort of a preconception that I hold. So I don't disagree with requirements for hard security. I don't disagree necessarily with doing peace building in a way that we privilege, bringing security to people where they haven't had it. I think that's a number one goal um, for peace building. Second of all, I do get people that say to me that they don't think that peace is a real thing. They don't think that conflict resolution is a real thing, and that the best way to end a war is through military victory, right? And there's evidence that we can cite that relates to stability, that says that military victory is a really stable way to end a war. And my answer to that is that everything that we know about civil wars in particular is that mostly what drives civil war, and therefore to prevent civil war, you need to pay attention to this, is horizontal inequality. It's social injustices. It's keeping identity groups, well-defined groups of people, um, out of being able to access economic power or political power, right? And there's a 2017 World Bank UN report. It's called Pathways to Peace, and they lay that out really, really well. And so, for at least a major category of conflict, what we need to be doing is paying attention to the social relationships. And so, providing security from the top down is great, but addressing social relationships in people's daily lived experiences is necessary if you don't want to just pour money down from the top all the time. That's unstable. Yeah, that
Mhm.
doesn't work.
Um, so, so thinking about how the nature of the world and work is changing for people who want to work somewhere at this intersection of the areas you're talking about, are there any growth areas you would say in terms of skills or careers? I mean, I'll give an example. So, for years people are like, I want to be a mediator, and like I think mediation is a fantastic skill set,
Yeah,
but most people who aspire to be mediators don't look at the supply and demand side. So
yeah,
the supply side is enormous, the demand side is small. And I finally found research and did a book chapter with an RA, I think in 2017 on this. So like, where do you see the growth in terms of like if you want to stay competitive and employed and actually make a difference in the world? I mean, apart from project management, language skills, understand fundraising, all that
mm,
stuff,
yeah.
what do you see as some of the sectoral areas that are growing or the skill sets that are needed?
So, one thing is that I want my students to think more holistically about what conflict resolution is. When you are going out and doing a wide variety of social impact work, you are doing conflict resolution. And I want my grads to be thinking that they're working in the field in which they're trained if they're doing more than just mediation. Um, Number two, I think we're going to see a lot of growth in this nexus of climate change and disasters and conflict. And Sherry Goodman at the Wilson Center says that climate change is a conflict multiplier, right? That there's not necessarily a direct causal impact between climate change and conflict. Um, and there's a Stanford University study in Nature that was out in 2019 that shows, we can expect this much more conflict in the system if we have this much more warming. Right? We should be expecting more conflict and disruption with climate change. We don't understand that very well, and we need to understand at the global level how those things intersect and how we can use conflict or climate adaptation work to do conflict prevention and peace building. Those things are going to have to go together, I think, more and more.
Yeah, just to say, if you have, I agree with that 100%. If you have climate expertise or policy expertise, combine with some other sector. And then the other sector I like to talk about with three others is finance, understanding both like private sector, but also the business of change. And then tech, if you speak geek and human, if you only speak one, but if you speak both. So just a couple more questions, and this is specific, not just specific to Georgetown, but anyone who's thinking about applying for a master's program. Obviously, we talked about the need to look in advance, look at opportunities, research multiple schools. So when you are reviewing applications, just like your advice for anybody applying for a master's or a fellowship, like what sparks joy with you and the reviewer, let's say, panel, and what are some things that don't spark joy that you might recommend as people are going through this huge effort, to think about?
I want to reiterate something I think you touched on earlier, which is that every time I read an application, and I read it holistically, so we look at everything you give us. We don't have any hard like this and not that, no numerical cutoffs, that sort of thing. We give you a holistic read. I'm looking for two things. One is your ability to succeed in the program. So I want to know that academically you've got the chops where you can come in and be successful. I want to make you more successful, but I want you to have a good experience, want you to be successful. So academic performance and fit, right? And fit is something that I see people make interesting cases for all the time. You can fit in conflict resolution from a wide variety of places and spaces. And so if you know what conflict resolution is and why you want to study it at Georgetown, that brings me joy. Just tell me that, right? I have this background in something strange and not peace and conflict studies, and I want to pursue conflict resolution because I want to bring that into my space. I love that. And those students bring so much perspective into the classroom, really a joy to have. So I love that. I also love mature students who've had some work experience in the classroom. They bring just a ton of value into, our class discussions. So I like to see that. So just make a case for yourself. Think it through. I hate seeing people tell me about how they're really excited to apply to George Washington University, which is a great university. It just means like you didn't edit enough before you press send. So just give it one more look.
Or the AI didn't edit enough, and this will be their first year with full AI, not full AI, but stronger AI.
Yeah.
So last two questions. When you have time and you're not, teaching and researching and parenting, any particular skills you're currently working on improving or just learning for yourself, whether it's related to your current work or just interests?
So I'm a meditator of long standing. I got training at Berkeley originally, so I'm always working on that. I think that to do conflict resolution, you have to have a big EQ. You have to have you have to be able to manage your own emotions. You have to have self-knowledge, and you have to maintain regulation in really dysregulated environments and project it out if to do it well. And so just trying to build your skills in that area, I think really makes you a better practitioner across the board. So I work on that in that semi-daily way. Yeah.
And do you use any apps, or you just have your own style that you've learned? I mean, like, is there anything like digital or book or a particular approach that you might encourage others to look at?
So I dabble in the Calm app, which I get for free. Thank you, Georgetown. And I subscribe personally to the 10% Happier app, which I love. And there are books that founder wrote that I found really helpful. Neither one of those is from the practice in which I have had formal training. So that's sort of like, tangential to my practice. And Liz Stanley, who's a professor in the Department of Government, has this amazing book. It's called Widen the Window. It's about the stress, trauma, resilience spectrum. And she has a meditation-ish project that she recommends. And it's scholarship and this specific niche of practice. I really love that book.
Okay. Wonderful. I'll just make a plug. Insight Timer we're addicted to. And especially with our son, every night we almost do a meditation. And there's a lot of good things out there. Obviously, apps are not the solution, but they could be a tool. And then the last question: any recent book, podcast, movie, or show? It doesn't have anything to do with like work. It can just be something that has you purely enjoyed or just got you thinking that you might say, hey, this is interesting, others might want to look at.
So I love podcasts. And I think my favorite podcast of all time is called Scene on Radio, SCENE on Radio. It's by John Biewen, who's a historian. And he does deep dive seasons. He had a season on the construction of whiteness, and he had another season on the construction of masculinity. They are just very beautifully researched, beautifully presented. So I wish everyone would listen to his whole run.
Okay. Actually, one last question, but I'll just say we're addicted to Only Murders in the Building. I don't know if you've seen
Oh,
that
yeah.
show, and it's like it's comedy, murder, mystery, and podcast. So, and it gets last question, just for people who, let's say, are not as familiar with the areas you work in. What organizations would is there any particular organizations or conferences you would encourage others to look at just to stay informed, or where there's interesting jobs or convenings?
Yeah. So I read The Economist and World Politics Daily, World Politics Review, the Daily Humanitarian, which used to be ERN News, is really great. DevX is great. DevX does news and has a jobs board, so highly recommend that. I used to look at Idealists. They, I read PCDN. PeaceCon is the one that, right, which is the Alliance for Peace Building. If you can go to PeaceCon, it's wonderful. It's a great networking opportunity. It's really where the practice is in that global space. It's usually in Washington, D.C. It's bounced around in timing a little bit during the pandemic. So I think it's back in June. Annually.
And they usually have an online component now.
Mm-hmm.
And these are great resources. And again, to say, the New Humanitarian at IRN News, really does some of the best kind of overview, but also critical analysis of more like emergency relief. But it's amazing.
Yeah.
And they have a podcast too. And then please check all these out. And then just last question for anyone who is potentially interested in Georgetown. Best two parts to the question. So best place to follow what the program's doing, the conflict resolution program, and just application deadlines.
So our application deadline is January 15th, and that's for entrance with the fall 2024 class. January 15th is an evergreen date, so for us, you can always find us there. And the best place to find us is on the web. And I don't have the website memorized.
No, we'll put it in the show notes.
But you can also follow us on Instagram. It's sort of, Instagram gives us a day-by-day look at what we're doing. So later this afternoon, we have an event on the update on Ukraine, Russia with USIP. So that's what I'll be doing in a couple hours.
So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, energy, and comments. And it was a wonderful session. And we had people from all over, lots of people from Nigeria, Kenya, but all over. So we got some, SABU applications are open for international students, the same deadline for international and domestic. And there was a couple other questions about fellowships. Again, look at ProFellow, PCN, all the fellowship places. And then just to wrap up, so thank you everyone for joining us. We have lots of other great things coming up in terms of the podcast. Please check out the Georgetown Conflict Resolution Program, PCN Global, and there's 120 other episodes of this podcast. If you go to our website, PCN Global, you can search by sector or by area, or you can just go to any podcasting platform and find it there. And if you rate or share, just helps grow our reach. And thank you, Katherine. I hope the last few weeks of your semester are as calm as possible. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned for our next episode.
Thank you, Craig.